Chicago, Union Station, December 1967, 11:00 a.m. The air on the platform was so icy and dense, it felt like you could cut it with a knife. But the cold was nothing compared to the wall of hatred that had risen between two men at Track 3. Marine Sergeant Bill Jones, a man with a square jaw and a scar slicing his cheek from eye to chin, raised his hand for a jolt. He wasn't planning on saying hello. He was planning to destroy. In his eyes, accustomed to seeing the enemy in the jungles, the man standing before him in the expensive cashmere coat was worse than an enemy. He was a traitor. The sergeant was certain that now, in front of his platoon of green recruits, he would break this dandy in half like a dry branch. He was certain that his authority was a hammer, and the rest of the world was a nail. But there was one thing he didn't know. In a few seconds, his world, built on regulations and brute force, would collapse without a single shot. He had made a fatal mistake. He decided he was looking at a private, forgetting that he was looking into the eyes of the Emperor. But to understand why this moment became the point of no return, we need to look at what happened 10 seconds earlier. Look at Muhammad Ali's left hand. This is the very detail, the dagger, that most would miss, but you must see it. In Ali's relaxed fingers is a morning copy of the Chicago Sun-Times. It's rolled into a tube, but the headline is clearly visible. Ali refuses induction. To Sergeant Jones, this piece of paper was like a red rag to a bull. It wasn't just a headline. It was a spit in the face of every boy currently freezing in the trenches of Vietnam. Jones couldn't walk past. His bazooka arms, pumped by years of push-ups and hatred, jerked on their own. The sergeant took a step forward, a sharp, rhythmic step that seemed to make the concrete vibrate underfoot. He didn't say a word. He simply knocked the newspaper out of the champion's hands with a hard, dismissive blow from the back of his hand. The paper flew, unfolding in flight like a downed bird, and splashed right into the dirty slush of snow and engine oil at the soldier's feet. Slap! That sound, in the echoing silence of the station, rang louder than a grenade blast. The recruits standing behind the sergeant stopped breathing. They knew that look of Jones's. It was the look before a kill. They expected the black draft dodger to run or start apologizing. After all, before him stood the U.S. Army in the flesh, a symbol of absolute, overwhelming power. Ali froze. He slowly shifted his gaze from his empty hand to the sergeant's face. There was no fear in his eyes. There was a void, a cold, cosmic void that was more terrifying than any threat. But Jones was blind. He saw only what he wanted to see, fear. He smirked, baring teeth yellowed by tobacco, and did the thing that finally snapped the trap shut. He stepped with his heavy army boot directly onto Ali's face, printed on the front page of the fallen newspaper. He began to grind the paper into the mud, twisting his soul as if extinguishing a cigarette butt. This wasn't just rudeness. This was a ritual humiliation. "You dropped this, Private," Jones growled, spit flying from his mouth. "Now pick it up. Fast. Ask yourself honestly, right now, what would you do when a mountain of muscle, vested with authority, is screaming at you, when dozens of witnesses are standing around, ready to laugh at your humiliation? The survival instinct screams, "Submit! Don't get involved! He has a weapon. He has the law." Most of us would break. We would pick up that damn newspaper, swallow the insult, and leave, justifying it by saying we were smarter. But Ali was not the majority. He stood motionless while Jones continued to grind his image into the dirt. It seemed the champion was paralyzed. It seemed the sergeant had won. The recruits began to snicker, feeling the tension bleed away. "Look, our hero deflated," someone whispered in the back row. And this is where the Santa Barbara effect kicks in, flipping the entire perception of the scene. We thought Ali was scared. We thought he was calculating the risks. But we were wrong. Ali wasn't afraid. He was waiting. He was waiting for Jones to cross the line from which there is no return. The sergeant, seeing the victims in action, decided the prey was cornered, his ego inflated to the size of a zeppelin. "I said pick up the trash, you deaf piece of sat," he roared, leaning into Ali's very face, violating every conceivable boundary of personal space. His square jaw was in dangerous proximity to the face of a man whose hands were registered as lethal weapons. Ali slowly, very slowly, began to lean down. The crowd exhaled. Could it be? Was the greatest really about to get on his knees in the mud to pick up trash at the command of some soldier? It looked like a surrender. Ali's shoulders slumped. His head bowed. Jones looked triumphantly at his soldiers. "See? In uniform, or out, they're all the same. You just need a firm hand." He relaxed. He lowered his guard, savoring the moment of his triumph. He thought he had broken the opponent's will, but he didn't notice that Ali wasn't leaning toward the newspaper. His hand wasn't moving toward the dirty snow. His fingers slid toward the lace of his own boot. It was the movement not of a servant, but of a predator preparing to spring. At the moment Ali froze in that half bow, time on the platform stopped, and a silent question hung in the air. What happens when the spring uncoils? Ali leaned toward the dirty concrete, and this gesture seemed to everyone present to be the final act of surrender. The recruits behind Sergeant Jones began to exchange glances, mocking smirks spreading across their faces. They had just witnessed their commander break the will of the man the papers called invincible. Sergeant Jones felt a rush of hot, intoxicating power, the very kind he wore the uniform for. He towered over the bent figure in the cashmere coat like an ancient idol demanding a sacrifice. He was already mentally rehearsing the line he'd dropped to his boys in the barracks that evening. "See, there are no champions. There are only those who obey and those who are made to." But at that moment, when triumph seemed absolute, something strange happened, something that made the smirks on the sergeant's face freeze like plaster. Ali wasn't reaching for the newspaper. His hands in expensive leather gloves stopped an inch from the dirty snow where his trampled image lay, but his fingers didn't even twitch toward the scrap paper. Instead, calmly, with a defiant slowness, he took the lace of his boot. Do you understand what this means? This was not a gesture of submission. This was a gesture of absolute annihilating indifference. While the sergeant screamed, spraying saliva, while the entire platoon waited for humiliation, Ali simply decided that his untied shoelace was more important than an order from a representative of the U.S. government. The sergeant blinked. His brain, wired for simple stimulus response commands, glitched. Why isn't he picking up the paper? Why is he acting as if Jones is just noise, the background hum of the station, unworthy of attention? "I'm waiting, Private," Jones barked, but a note of uncertainty slipped into his voice, a thin crack in the armor that those around him instantly caught. The silence on the platform changed its tone. If a second ago it was the silence of awaiting an execution, now it was the silence of confusion. Ali finished messing with his footwear. He neatly adjusted the knot, brushed an invisible speck of dust from his knee, and began to straighten up. And here, the Santa Barbara effect triggered, flipping the chessboard. We are used to thinking that a man rising from his knees is in a weak position, but Ali wasn't rising like a victim. He was rising like a straightening spring, like a rocket on a launch pad, and there was so much hidden kinetic energy in that movement that Sergeant Jones instinctively took half a step back. When Ali straightened to his full height, the unexpected happened. The distance vanished. Ali didn't just stand in his place. He was suddenly, frighteningly, intimately close to the sergeant's face. So close that Jones could see his own distorted reflection in the boxer's dark pupils. So close that the scent of Ali's expensive cologne mingled with the smell of the sergeant's cheap tobacco, creating a nauseating cocktail of conflict. This was an invasion, a crude, arrogant violation of personal space that in the animal world means only one thing: a fight to the death is about to begin. But Ali didn't raise his fists. He stood with his arms down at his sides, completely open, and looked down at the sergeant. Yes, specifically down, even though they were the same height. It was an optical illusion, created by pure charisma. Sergeant Jones felt sweat trickle down his back under his warm jacket. He suddenly realized the newspaper was still lying in the mud. The order was not followed. His authority, which he had built through years of drill and shouting, was now melting like the snow under his feet. The soldiers behind him stopped laughing. They felt the air change. This was no longer the bullying of a child. This was a duel of gazes, and their indestructible sergeant was losing it with every second of silence. Jones understood. He had to do something. Right now. If he stayed silent, if he backed down, he would lose the respect of the platoon forever. His face flushed with blood. The scar on his cheek turned white, becoming an ugly welt. Rage began to displace his confusion. "Are you deaf, you piece of sod?" Jones hissed, and his hand reached for the baton on his belt. It was the reflex of a cornered beast. He wanted to regain control the only way available to him. Violence. But before his fingers could touch the weapon, Allie spoke. And it wasn't a shout. It was a whisper. A soft, velvet whisper that cut through the station's roar like a laser. "Look at me, Bill," Allie said, calling him by the name embroidered on his chest patch, instantly stripping him of rank and status, reducing him to the level of a mere mortal. "You think you're loud? You think you're scary?" Allie leaned even closer, almost touching noses with the sergeant. In his eyes danced little devils, that same fire that burned opponents in the ring before the first bell ever rang. Jones froze. His hand stopped halfway to his belt. He was paralyzed by this whisper, by this monstrous confidence of a man standing unarmed before an armed Marine and smiling. "I've wrestled with alligators, Bill. I've tussled with a whale. I done shackled lightning and thrown thunder in jail," Allie continued to whisper, his words sounding like a voodoo incantation. "And you're just a little man in a big hat. And you know what the funniest part is?" Allie paused, creating a vacuum that demanded to be filled. Sergeant Jones, forgetting how to breathe, stared into those hypnotic eyes, expecting a punch, expecting a scream, expecting anything but the truth. And at that moment, Allie slowly raised his hand, not for a strike. His hand moved smoothly, like smoke, heading toward the most sacred thing the sergeant had, his head. Muhammad Ali's hand continued to rise, and the movement was so fluid, lingering, and hypnotic that it felt like slow motion in the climax of a Hollywood action movie, where the hero is about to deliver a lethal blow. Sergeant Jones, whose instincts were forged in the furnace of the brutal drill at Paris Island, finally snapped out of his stupor, and his reaction was instantaneous, like the click of an M16 bolt. He saw that leather-gloved hand flying toward his face, and his brain, poisoned by adrenaline and wounded pride, produced the only possible interpretation in his worldview. This is an attack. He decided to hit a Marine, flashed through Jones's mind, and the thought triggered an explosion of dark, almost sadistic triumph. Finally, now he had the legal, moral, and judicial right to destroy this arrogant punk, to turn his pretty face into a bloody pulp and write it all off as necessary self-defense. The sergeant was no longer confused. He was back in his element, in the understandable world of raw violence where the one who hits first is right. Do you think you know what happened next? You probably expect a classic block and a brutal counterattack, like in hand-to-hand combat manuals. Forget everything you were taught in Rocky movies, because reality is about to break your expectations over its knee. Jones didn't block. He decided to act preemptively, using the opponent's momentum against him. His left hand, heavy, calloused, and hard as a blacksmith's hammer, lunged forward to grab Ali by the lapel of that very expensive cashmere coat. The plan was simple and effective. Jerk the punk toward him, into a crushing right uppercut that was already charging in his hip and the rotation of his torso. It was a perfect killing mechanism, refined on hundreds of recruits who dared to look their instructor in the eye. The soldiers behind the sergeant gasped, a sound like the whistle of air sucked in before a scream of terror. They saw Jones's fingers, like steel hooks, practically touching the soft fabric of the coat. It seemed the steel trap had snapped shut. Allie was caught in the dead zone of impact, from which no one walks away whole. But in that exact fraction of a second, when the coat fabric should have crumpled in the sergeant's fist, reality glitched, making everyone doubt the laws of physics. Allie didn't jump back. He didn't duck. He made that tiny, almost invisible movement of the neck and upper body that sports doctors and physicists still cannot rationally explain. He shifted exactly 3 centimeters to the right. It was the movement of a ghost, the dance of smoke in the wind. Jones's hand, into which he had put all his rage, all his body mass, and all his hatred for this man, sliced through empty air with such an ominous whistle that it seemed to break the sound barrier. Momentum is a merciless that doesn't forgive misses. The sergeant, expecting to meet the resistance of flesh, fell into a void. His heavy army boots slipped on the icy slush of the platform, and losing his balance, he flailed his arms ridiculously, trying to grab the atmosphere to keep from falling face first into the mud. And here comes the moment of truth, the very Santa Barbara plot twist that makes the heart skip a beat and turns everything upside down. We thought Ali would kill him with a punch. We expected a knockout, a shattered jaw, blood on the snow. But Ali didn't clench his fist. His hand, which all this time had continued its smooth, inevitable ascent, reached its goal. But the goal wasn't the jaw. It wasn't the nose. The goal was the sergeant's head. More precisely, what was on it and what defined the very essence of this man. Ali's fingers, long, artistic, created to make history, closed softly, almost with maternal tenderness, on the brim of Sergeant Jones's uniform cover. Do you understand what a drill instructor's cover is to a Marine? It's not just headgear. It's a crown. It's the holy grail of his power, the symbol of his untouchability, his status as a god of war and absolute authority. Removing a sergeant's cover while he is on duty is worse than spitting in his face or hitting him in the groin. It is an act of spiritual castration, a total and complete nullification of his persona. Ali didn't rip it off. He removed it neatly, elegantly, like a magician removing a silk cloth from a rabbit, and he did it at the exact moment when Jones, staggering and huffing, was trying to regain his vertical position after his shameful miss. The sergeant froze. He felt the icy, piercing Chicago wind on his buzz-cut scalp, and that cold was more terrifying than any napalm burn. A visual silence of such density fell over Union Station that it seemed everyone present had their eardrums burst from the pressure drop. The roar of the trains vanished. The screech of brakes dissolved into nothingness. All that remained was the sight of Sergeant Jones, the fearsome, invincible bulldog, the terror of recruits, standing bareheaded, disheveled, with bulging eyes that read the collapse of his entire universe. And opposite him stood Ali, unperturbed, radiant, like an ancient deity of retribution. He held the sergeant's cover on the tip of his index finger and began to slowly, mockingly spin it like a basketball. It was a sight so surreal that the brain refused to accept it as fact. The greatest had turned a symbol of military tyranny into a cheap circus prop. Jones opened his mouth to scream, to order this punk shot on the spot, but only a pathetic, gurgling wheeze escaped his throat. He was exposed. Without his crown, he was suddenly just Bill, a confused man with a scar who had just been outplayed in a game whose rules he didn't even know. The cover with the Marine Corps emblem spun on Muhammad Ali's index finger with perfect, frightening symmetry, turning into a blurred khaki smudge. This hypnotic top became the center of the universe for every person on the Union Station platform, from the frozen recruits to the random passers-by who stopped, sensing that history was being made right here, right now. Sergeant Jones, a man whose neck was thicker than an average civilian's thigh, stood absolutely still, as if his boots were frozen to the concrete. His hands, those terrible instruments of destruction, hung helplessly at his sides, twitching in the rhythm of a nervous tick. Why isn't he attacking? Why isn't he tearing this arrogant man to pieces? Because in this second, he was experiencing something more terrible than physical pain. He was experiencing a loss of identity. Without his headgear, with his bald head open to all winds, he suddenly shrank in size. He stopped being the sergeant, a symbol of the system, and turned into just Bill, a confused, middle-aged man whose favorite toy had been taken by a bully. Do you think Allie was enjoying this moment just to stroke his own ego? You're wrong. Allie wasn't a sadist. He was a surgeon, and right now, he was performing surgery on an open ego. He abruptly stopped the spinning of the cover with his other hand. The clap of his palm against the fabric sounded like a gunshot, making Jones flinch. The sergeant made a jerky movement forward, trying to snatch his property, his fingers curling, ready to claw into the cloth. But Allie was faster than thought. He pulled his hand back exactly 1 centimeter further than Jones could reach. It was a game of keep away, but the stakes weren't a bone. They were the honor of the uniform. Not so fast, Bill, Allie whispered, his voice full of icy calm. You want your crown back? But can a king really afford to lose his head over a piece of paper? Allie nodded toward the dirty snow, where the trampled newspaper with his portrait still lay. That very dagger planted at the start of the scene now pierced the sergeant's heart. Jones got the hint. He realized that his anger, his attempt to humiliate the champion through a newspaper, had led to him being humiliated himself. It was a noose he had tightened around his own neck. A flash of understanding, mixed with helpless rage, flickered in the sergeant's eyes. He opened his mouth to say something, perhaps to shout a regulation curse, but Ali didn't give him the chance. He stepped right up to the sergeant. The distance vanished again. Ali towered over him, holding the cover with both hands as if a priest were holding a mitre before a coronation. A soldier without a head is a corpse, Sergeant, Ali said loudly enough for every recruit in the formation to hear. You let anger take your head. On the battlefield, you'd be dead already, and the dead don't give orders. It was checkmate. Ali had turned the situation upside down. From a draft dodger and coward, he had transformed into a wise mentor, teaching a professional soldier the basics of survival. Jones stood there, breathing heavily, his face breaking out in red blotches. He was crushed by the logic of a man he had considered a stupid boxer. He expected Ali to throw the cover on the ground, to stomp it into the mud, just as Jones had stomped the newspaper. That would have been fair. It would have been an eye for an eye. We all expected it. The spectators held their breath, waiting for the final act of revenge. But Ali deceived expectations again. He didn't throw the cover. He neatly brushed an invisible speck of dust off the brim. This gesture of care was more terrifying than any blow. Ali raised the cover over the sergeant's head. Jones instinctively tucked his head into his shoulders, expecting a trick, but didn't dare move. He was hypnotized. Ali began to lower the cover, slowly, solemnly, as if returning a king's power to him. The crowd exhaled. Was he really forgiving him? Was this a gesture of reconciliation? For a second it seemed they would shake hands, and the conflict would be resolved. We believed in the nobility of the moment. And then Ali did it. At the very moment the cover touched the sergeant's head, Ali, with a light, almost imperceptible flick of the wrist, spun it. He didn't put it on according to regulations. He put it on backward, and not just backward, but rakishly tilted to the side. Click. The cover sat tight. Ali removed his hands and stepped back, admiring his work. Before us no longer stood a fearsome Marine Corps instructor. Before us stood a ridiculous, caricatured character, looking like an overgrown schoolyard bully or a drunk clown after a party. This single stroke, the reversed brim, instantly destroyed the entire aura of danger emanating from Jones. He looked ridiculous, and the most terrible thing was, he didn't see it yet. He felt the weight of the cover on his head and thought the status quo had been restored. But he didn't see his soldier's eyes. Ali did. He looked over the sergeant's shoulder, straight at the line of recruits, and winked at them. It was the spark that was supposed to blow the powder keg. Muhammad Ali's wink acted on the line of recruits like a detonator connected to a barrel of gunpowder. For a second, just one endless second, silence reigned on the Union Station platform, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of suppressed hysteria. Young men, whose souls only yesterday were shackled by terror of Bulldog Jones, suddenly saw in their tormentor not a god of war, but a ridiculous clown in a flipped hat. The first to break was a skinny private in the third row. A stifled sound, like a sneeze, escaped his nose. That was the spark. A moment later, the dam burst. The laughter didn't just start. It exploded like shrapnel, hitting the sergeant in the back. This wasn't a polite chuckle. This was the wild, animal, liberating laughter of people who realized the king wasn't just naked. He was hilarious. Sergeant Jones froze. This sound was more terrifying to him than a burst of machine gun fire. Slowly, as if in a dream, he raised his hand to his head. His fingers touched the back of his head and hit the hard brim. Reality crashed down on him like a concrete slab. He stood before his subordinates, before civilians, before himself, as a caricature. His face, crimson with rage, instantly turned ash gray. Do you think he ripped the cover off? Do you think he lunged at Ali? No. The shock was so deep it paralyzed his motor functions. He stood and listened to his empire of fear crumble, destroyed not by fists, but by a simple turn of a hat. In the recruit's eyes, there was no longer terror. There was contempt. And a sergeant without the fear of his subordinates is just a man shouting at the wind. But Ali wasn't finished. He never left loose ends. Remember the newspaper? The very dagger the sergeant had stomped into the mud at the very beginning to humiliate the champion. Ali looked away from the morally destroyed sergeant and looked down, to where his image lay in the gray slush. He slowly leaned down, exactly as he had leaned to tie his shoelace. But now, no one dared to hurry him. No one dared to breathe. Ali picked up the wet, dirty copy of the Chicago Sun-Times. He held it with 2 fingers, as if it were a precious papyrus. Sergeant Jones, finally regaining the ability to move, jerked forward, perhaps to interfere, to somehow regain control, but the laughter behind his back grew louder, pinning him to the spot. He was powerless. Any movement he made now would look like the convulsions of a dying cockroach. Ali straightened up. He looked at his face on the front page, crossed out by the dirty print of an army boot. Do you expect him to crumple it? To throw it in the sergeant's face? That would be too simple. Ali pulled a snow-white handkerchief from his pocket, the very contrast that stings the eye. He began to slowly, methodically wipe the mud off the photograph. It was an act of incredible dignity. He wasn't cleaning paper. He was cleaning his name. He was showing that no mud, no boots, no system could tarnish what shines from within. Mud washes off, Bill, Ali said, not looking at the sergeant, speaking as if to the universe itself. But shame eats in forever. He neatly folded the newspaper and tucked it under his arm. Then he turned his back on Jones. This was the final insult. To turn your back on an enemy, showing you don't consider him a threat. Ali walked toward the train car. His coat billowed in the icy wind, and there was music in his stride. Sergeant Jones remained standing on the platform, surrounded by a laughing platoon, with his cover on backward and a void inside that could never again be filled by drill. He realized he had lost a fight that hadn't even begun. He wanted to break a man, but he broke his teeth on granite. And when the car doors hissed shut behind the greatest, cutting him off from the noise and grime of the station, we, the viewers, are left with the main question echoing in our heads. Ali could have hit him. He could have sent the sergeant to the hospital, and it would have been just by the laws of the street. But he chose the path of psychological aikido. He used the enemy's strength to destroy the enemy himself. Years later, the veterans of that platoon would tell their grandchildren not about Vietnam, but about that day at the station in Chicago. About the day they realized that true strength is not a loud voice or a heavy fist. True strength is the calm, before which even an army retreats. Now look at yourself in the mirror. Remember the moments when you shouted, trying to prove you were right. Remember when you used force, because you lacked arguments. Sergeant Jones lives in each of us. It is our ego, afraid of looking ridiculous. But Allie lives in each of us too. The part of the soul that knows true greatness requires no proof. Whose side are you on today? Are you ready to admit that sometimes laughter is the deadliest weapon? Or do you think Ali crossed the line by humiliating a soldier in front of his formation? Write one word in the comments. Force, if you are for the sergeant's methods, or spirit, if you are for Ali's lesson. I'll be waiting, because your choice defines who you really are when life tries to grind you into the dirt.